People call Dr. Gabor Maté the people whisperer.
Legendary thinker and best-selling author.
He's highly sought after for his expertise on addiction, stress, and childhood development.
So that my workaholism, which came out of my need to prove the value of my existence, which came out of my 1-year-old experience, made me very successful in this world, very high respected and well paid. And it made me ignore my own children because, of course, when the beeper went, I was out of the house. So this is how trauma is passed on from one generation to the next, not intentionally, by the most loving parents, because we can't help it until we deal with it ourselves.
You mentioned trauma passed on from one generation to the next. When one experiences trauma like you've identified, being abandoned as a child, I think that's easier to identify. Whereas generational trauma, if there's trauma passed down from my grandfather, who passed away before I was born, a little more difficult to identify. How does one go about that process in identifying the generational trauma that's been passed down?
Let me just say that 95% of trauma is multi-generational. That's just how it works. We unwittingly pass it on. Now, it's certainly true that from a biological point of view, when grandparents are traumatized, some of that is passed on into the genetic functioning of even their grandchildren. Not their genes as such, but how those genes are triggered or not triggered, how they come activated or how they don't. So that's called epigenetics. But that's just an emerging field. They're only beginning to understand it now. But I would say that any trauma that was passed on to you from your grandfather didn't skip a generation. It was passed on to you. Was this a maternal or a paternal grandfather?
Both, and me specifically, both my grandfathers died before I was born. And I just think it's an example. A lot of people have grandparents they've never met.
I would say that whatever was passed on to you happened through your parents and through your parents' experience in life, which they hadn't quite resolved by the time they had you. That's how I would say that the multi-generation is passed on. And a lot of, sometimes, Jason, people tell me, I had a perfectly happy childhood, and that usually takes me about 3 minutes to sort that one out. So,
well, it does bring the point, I think, if one does the work, they can identify the trauma in their own life. But I think it becomes a lot more difficult when you're trying to identify the potential trauma in a parent or a grandparent who maybe is not open to doing the work or hasn't shared the trauma. And if you're saying 95% trauma is passed down, I'm just trying to give people an idea of what they can do to understand that, to do the necessary work.
Well, so I think the more people understand their own traumas, the more see with clear eyes the traumas of others. So here's the point about trauma. Recall what I said. Trauma is not what happened to you, it's what happened inside you. So trauma is the wound. Trauma is not the event, it's the wound that you're carrying. That means you're carrying into the present. It's an unhealed wound is what it is. And so that trauma doesn't have to be recalled as such always, because it's always remembered. So there's a difference between recall and remembering. Recall is conscious. I can recall what I had for breakfast. I can recall our conversation so far. I can recall what somebody said to me when I was 5 years old. That's calling it back. That's the conscious recall. But the body has a memory in it. The nervous system has a memory in it that is not necessarily conscious, but the wound will still show up in the present moment. So you tell me the last time you were upset with somebody, and I can tell you exactly your childhood trauma. Because 95% of upsets, like it says in the Course of Miracles, we're never upset about what we're upset about. So most of the time people are upset, it's about something else. And so in the first chapter of this book, I talk about how my wife is not there to pick me up at the airport on my return from a speaking trip. I go into this rage and this withdrawal. Well, what's that about? It's not about me being 70 years old and my wife, the artist, forgot that she had a husband when she was in the middle of a painting. That's only been going on for the last 50 years, for God's sakes. It's about the fact that the memory that I don't recall, but the emotional memory of abandonment is triggered in my brain. And so it's very easy for me to tell about somebody's childhood trauma just if they tell me the last time they were really upset with somebody in their lives. Usually it's about old stuff.
What role does perspective play here? Let's say two people experience a similar traumatic event, say a car accident, for example, same injuries, same experience. One walks away feeling blessed that they didn't have more serious injuries. The other, walks away feeling unlucky and victim, and it defines them.
Yeah. So uncanny that you would say that, because I often talk about that very example from my own family practice of people being, say, rear-ended with about the same force, and one of them develops severe back pain and depression, and the other, no big deal. And the insurance companies say, well, how can this is not possible because there was the same impact as the other person, and they're not suffering. Why are you? Here's the deal. Trauma is, again, not what happens to you. It's what happens inside you as a result. So when you said the same traumatic event happened to the both of them, no, it didn't. They both had a car accident. One was traumatized, the other wasn't. Now, what's the difference? Here's what I found in family practice. And as a family practitioner, I did have an advantage over my specialist colleagues in that I knew my patients. I knew their family histories. I knew their backgrounds. I knew them as individuals. Two people get rear-ended with the same force, okay? One of them had childhood trauma. Let's say they were abused, okay? The other didn't. The car accident and the abuse have something in common. The child did nothing to bring it on. They couldn't have foreseen it, and they couldn't have protected themselves against it. That's the same with the car accident. Do you see the similarity? Number one. Number two, the person who's traumatized tends to carry themselves more stiffly, more in a defensive mode. People are traumatized, their nervous system tends to be more in a defensive mode. When your nervous system is in defensive mode, you tend to be more rigid. Now, take a blade of grass or take a piece of straw and bend them. What happens to the grass when you bend it? It rebounds. What happens to the straw when you bend it with the same force? It breaks. So you have two different mentalities and you have two different physiologies undergoing the same impact. You got that so far? The third point is the person who complains of severe pain tends not to be believed. Nobody listens to them. You're making it up. You're just trying to get a big payout. You're trying to get off work. That reinforces their childhood experience of nobody being there for them and people not even believing them. Now, no wonder that second person is more traumatized than the first. So the point is, perception, as you put it, has everything to do with it. It's who is it happening to, and what is their view of themselves and of the world. The person who perceives the world already as dangerous and unpredictable, they can be hurt. The other person, no, they just walk away. So that's the difference. But the level of trauma, although the externals look quite different, was at the same degree as mine. We always find somebody at the same level of traumatization, which means that in a good relationship, people can grow up together. And most of my growing up has been and continues to be in my marriage. Because as I say in the first chapter, is that my misfortune is that I married somebody who understands me. She doesn't let me get away with being the poor traumatized child in the body of an adult. She demands that her needs be met. That wasn't always the case, by the way. There was a period in my life when my wife really suppressed herself. She suffered. And then she learned, nah, not anymore. Now I had to either keep up with her or say goodbye. I'd rather prefer to keep up with her. And so the marriage relationship, I think, is a wonderful opportunity if both are willing to heal trauma and to grow up together. Thank you for watching. You can get my book, The Myth of Normal, in hardcover, audio, or ebook by clicking the link below in the description. And thanks again.